Morning. Today, I'd like to talk about the effect of German rental regulation, which is known under the name of rental brake, on housing construction. So, it is a joint work of me and a colleague of mine, Michael Voigtländer. So, rent control has a long history in Germany. At the national level, it was introduced in 1922. And since then, it never really disappeared. It was deregulated, re-regulated, but it was always there. And nowadays, starting from approximately 2013, we have a new wave of re-regulation, of tightening of rent control. In particular, the current government, the federal current government, which is a coalition of different parties that came to the power in May 2025, agreed to reform rent control in its coalition agreement. And the Minister of Justice, Stefanie Hubik, which is, by the way, shown here in the middle of the picture, convened an expert group, an expert commission on rental law. In German, it's called Mietrecht Expertenkommission. Here we see this commission. By the way, two of the authors of this report, of this paper, are shown here. So Michael Voigtländer and me. This commission includes representatives of tenants, landlords, employees, homeowners, builders, researchers, and judges. We too represent here the researchers' side. And you can imagine that the positions in this group remain divided because you have representatives of, in a sense, opposite groups, but the ministries insist on tightening rent control. So the hope, or as far as I understand it, of the ministry is to make regulations tighter. I myself see my objective as researcher to report the results of empirical research, to support the work of the Commission with statistical data and statistical results. So that in one of sessions, I presented the impacts of rent control on housing rents, on quality of housing, on residential mobility, and also on supply and housing construction. And it's evident from the results that I presented, which were based on more than 200 empirical studies, that rent control has negative impact on housing construction and supply. However, some of the groups said, well, there's first generation of rent control, second generation of rent control, and you're simply mixing them. So we don't see the results, for example, for the second generation of rent control. And according to them, rental brake is one of the examples of the second generation control. For those of you who don't know this distinction between first and second generation of rent control, I should say that the first generation rent control is basically a rent freeze. So the government raises rents and the landlords may not increase them without any official permission. By contrast, the second generation of rent control means that the rents can be increased, but the increase is limited. So it shouldn't exceed the change in the cost of living, for example, in the consumer price index. So rental brake is considered to be rent control of the second generation, although it has some elements of the first generation too. Anyway, I presented also result for the first and the second generation separately, as you can see here. So the first column are effects of the first generation rent control and supply and construction of housing, while the second column represents the results for the second generation of rent control. And the red bar corresponds to the proportion of studies or number of studies that found negative effect of rent control, for example, on supply. So here, for the first generation, we have almost 90% of studies that found that when you tighten rent control or reintroduce it or introduce it, you have declining supply of housing. Same thing for construction, although here we have just 75% of studies that found this effect. Yellow means studies that found no statistically significant effect, and green, finally, means studies that found statistically significant positive effect. If we look now at the results for the first generation of rent control, then we find that qualitatively no big changes happened. So you have less studies that found negative effects on supply, but still these are 2/3. In case of construction, it's less clear cut because here we have just 45, just below 50% of studies that found negative effects of rent control on construction. And about 47, 48% found no effect, while a couple other studies found even positive effect. So you can conclude that the first generation of rent control has a clear negative impact on construction and supply, while second generation rent control is less harmful, but still can be harmful. The next critique was, okay, you separated the first generation and the second generation of rent control, but you are still mixing different countries. So we see here evidence from many different countries, and what we need is Germany. We would like to focus on Germany. And indeed, there are not so many studies on this subject done for Germany. Actually, there's one stemming from 2019, which looks at demolitions of housing with the purpose to build something new at their place. So it's a kind of indirect evidence. So that study found that rental break led to more demolitions and hence supposedly to more construction afterward. And we decided therefore to fill this gap because we have now 7 years of data more, and we can focus on direct effects. And we have already completions of housing, data on completions of housing that we can use for our purposes. But first, let's define rental break. So what kind of policy it is? Rental break, or in German Mietpreisbremse, it's a policy that restricts newly negotiated rents. So if you are a landlord, you may not set new rent that would exceed typical local rent by more than 10%. So you have rents paid for similar dwellings in similar neighborhoods. These are typical local rents, and you may set your new rent as typical local rent plus 10%. You may set it at plus 5%, plus 0% level, but not plus 11, plus 12 level. This policy is not applied to the whole of the country. It only restricts to rent pressure zones that are shown in this graph by red color. This is, by the way, the picture at that shows all rent pressure zones that were introduced from the beginning of these policies. And these rent pressure zones are municipalities or their parts chosen by Länder, federal state. So you see here these black borders, they correspond to borders of federal states, and there are 16 of them in Germany. So these federal states are choosing rent pressure zones based on 4 criteria: quickly rising rents, very high rental burden, very low construction, and low vacancies. Okay, and then they declare a particular municipality or part of it as rent pressure zone, in which the regulation is going to be applied. But even in these zones, you have housing which is exempted from rent control. These are dwellings completed or substantially renovated starting from October 2014. So even if they are located in rent pressure zones, they are not subject to rental break. And I must add at this point also that this regulation is adopted at the national level, and therefore it's uniform. So it, in a sense of application, so the way it's applied is identical in all these federal states and all these municipalities. This policy, rental break, was introduced in 2015, as you can see here in this graph, and the idea was that it would be scheduled for the next last for 5 years, but then it was reintroduced or extended twice in 2020 and 2025. Now we have already 11 years of rental break, and by early 2026, the number of rental break municipalities had risen to 866. Overall, there are almost 11,000 municipalities in Germany. So it seems to be a rather small number, less than 9% of all municipalities in Germany are subject to rent control. But you should know that those that are subject to rent control are different from those that do not have them. They have more population, they have more dwellings in multifamily housing, they have smaller dwellings, they have lower vacancy rates. So in a sense, this is a very different group of municipalities compared to those without rental break. So it's better, in order to approximate the importance of rental break areas, you should better rely on a different indicator. In this case, we looked at the population that lives in those areas. And that's what this graph shows. So here we have the proportion of population living in rent pressure zones. And we see that in the first year after its introduction, or of its introduction, the proportion of population living in rental break zones increased from 0 to 25%. And the next increase was in 2025 from 30 to 35%. So now more than 1/3 of German population lives in rental break areas. A graphic illustration for the effects of rental break on construction is presented here. It's very rough, so it does the eyeballing, I should say. So red color denotes regions with rental break, black color denotes regions without rental break. In the upper panel, we have total completions of dwellings in residential buildings. In the lower panel, we have completions of dwellings in multifamily houses, in other words, flats or apartments. And what I did, I computed the number of completions in both groups of areas, of groups of regions, and then calculated an index. So 2014 is equal to 100%. Why did I do this? Because the numbers are different. There is more housing built in rental break areas than in areas without rental break. So to make them both lines comparable, I scaled them by indexing to 2014. What we see here is that in both cases, the two series are evolving at the same rate in a parallel way. So we have a kind of parallel trend assumption being met. And then after 2017, we have a divergence. So the rental break areas, or construction in rental break areas, start to to stagnate and then to decline, while it continues to grow for a while in the areas without rental break. Same thing happened in the construction of apartments. And then after 2021, with surge in construction costs, with a jump of interest rates, we have decline in both types of areas. So these two factors, they were way too powerful. So they affected dynamics in both regions with and without rental break. Now, if we want to provide some reliable results based on sophisticated statistical methods, then we should probably use a method that takes into account the staggered introduction of rental break. So we have different areas that introduce rental break at different time periods. Okay, and one appropriate methodology to be used in this case is difference in differences, which takes into account the possibly changing trends after introduction of rental break in groups with rental break, while trends in the group without rental break, group of regions without rental break, should follow the same trend as observed before introduction of rental break. And that's what basically difference in differences does. So it accounts for staggered introduction of rental break. And there are many different estimators using this approach. Here we choose Colloway and Sant'Anna, Sun and Abraham, and Gardner. They appear to be more reliable in this context. As data, we used statistics on dwelling completions, and in our main specification, we use the so-called log+1 transformation. So if YIT is the number of dwellings being completed in municipality I in year T, then we add 1 to it, take log and multiply by 100. Why do we do this at all? Because in many cases, because many municipalities are very small, and in many cases, in some years at least, they do not construct any housing at all. So YIT is equal to 0. So if we were just simply to take logs, then of course log of 0 is infinity, and we would lose too many observations. And in addition, the numbers of construction is very volatile in smaller municipalities. Overall, we have almost 11,000 municipalities, and we consider the period between 2010 and 2024. So we conducted estimations, and one way of reporting them is to use the event study that shows us the dynamic effects of the regulation. So here we have 0, which is the year when rental break was introduced, and all the years to the left of it are the years prior to introduction of rental break in this particular municipality. The point denote point estimates of the effects of the average effect, average treatment effect, while whiskers here denote confidence band. So if 0 line is inside these two whiskers, then we say that this point estimate is not statistically significant. And that's what we mostly observe here, is that none of these, or just one of these effects, are statistically significant, meaning that the assumption of parallel trends is fulfilled. Then to the right of it, we have, again, point estimates and whiskers that show us the effect after introduction of rental break in rental break areas. And that actually, this is the difference between rental break areas and areas without rental break. So they estimate. So they show us the evolution of construction in rental break areas compared to areas without rental break. And here we see that these estimates are always negative and in most cases statistically significant, meaning that introduction of rental break led to substantially less construction completions of housing units in areas with rental break. Okay. The same kind of analysis we conducted for apartments, for dwellings in multifamily houses, and we have got essentially the same picture, meaning that rental break also negatively affects construction of apartments, which is a kind of ironic because the purpose of rental break is to protect tenants, and by declining production of apartments, it undermines the habitat of tenants. Why? Because in Germany, at least, there's a very high correlation between share of multifamily housing and tenant rate, proportion of tenant households in total number of households. So basically, although you may be a homeowner living in an apartment, as a rule, apartments are populated by tenants. So these are rental dwellings in most cases. We did also a bunch of robustness checks. So apart from total completions and completions of dwellings in multifamily houses, we also looked at completions per inhabitant, completions minus demolitions per housing stock. And we used also 4 different subsamples because we know that rental break areas differ from other areas in many dimensions. So we want actually these 2 groups to be more similar to each other. Therefore, we try to restrict our sample in several ways. For example, we excluded 2 big municipalities, those whose population exceeds 500,000, like Berlin, Munich, Hamburg. On the other hand, we tried to exclude the smaller municipalities. So we took only those that have population of exceeding 50,000 persons, because we said, well, smaller municipalities, they have also much volatile construction numbers. In one year, they have no construction. Next year, they have 10 units. The year after that, they have 2 units being completed. It's very volatile. Let's exclude them. We tried also this subsample. By the way, these are different subsamples. We are not applying all these criteria at the same time. We also looked at regions with relatively small home ownership, so home ownership rate below 60%. And this is basically similar to excluding smaller municipalities, because the smaller the municipality, the higher home ownership rate. And finally, we looked also at rental break areas and their neighbors. Okay, so we said that geographical proximity can guarantee a high degree of similarity of regions. So we took K nearest neighbors as a way of defining neighbors. And alternatively, we looked at neighbors sharing common border. So our main specification is K nearest neighbors, because some of the regions are islands, so they don't have other neighbors with common land border. But anyway, results obtained for K nearest neighbors and for neighbors sharing common border are very similar. We have 4 variables, 4 different subsamples. We have also 3 different estimation techniques. So you can imagine how many different different combinations we considered. And we looked at their average treatment and treated effects that are always negative, and in most cases statistically significant. In some specifications, we have violation of the parallel trends assumption, but overall we find that results are more or less consistent, and they point in the same direction, that rental break led to less housing construction. Now the last question to answer is why it's the case. So what causes rental break to reduce housing construction, although by its design, this policy exempts new construction? So how can we solve this paradox? So there is an exception on new construction. There's no rental break for newly built housing, and still the policy leads to less housing completions. We have at least two related explanations for this phenomenon. The first one is increased regulatory uncertainty. So we know that rental break was introduced in 2015, and then the government extended it twice. So it somehow solidified the expectation of housing market being regulated. So the market participants see that it's not something that is transitory. It's rather something that is going to be extended again and again and again. In the meanwhile, we also have the so-called Berlin's Mietendeckel on rent freeze in 2020-21. It was later upthrown by the Federal Constitutional Court. So in that period, rents were effectively frozen in Berlin. Also in Berlin, in September 2021, there was a referendum on nationalization of housing belonging to large private housing companies. And actually, the majority of Berlin's population decided that this housing stock should be nationalized. So hundreds of thousands of private dwellings, according to the results of this referendum, had to be nationalized. By now, it didn't lead to any big political moves, so there was no large-scale nationalization of housing in Berlin. But still, it's a kind of sign to the potential investors, the potential and existing investors. And lastly, if you look at the political disputes in Germany, you will see that there are many different ideas circulating in these debates. One of them is to shift the exemption cutoff year from 2014 to 2019. So remember, for the moment, newly built housing exempted from regulation is defined as the housing completed starting from October 2014. So if we shift this year to 2019, then automatically we will have less exemptions. So all this increases regulatory uncertainty and therefore risks. So the investors demand higher risk premia, which leads to higher higher required rate of return, maybe also to higher interest rates asked from home builders. And this means that some of the projects that have lower rate of return, they are not profitable anymore, so they are not going to be undertaken. Money is not going to be invested in those projects. And the second explanation is that reduced rental revenues limit financing of new projects. In other words, if you are a landlord, you have housing stock and you would like to build new housing to add to it, you have to rely on some sources of finance. And your main source is, of course, rental revenues that you get from your existing housing stock, and if this existing housing stock is subject to rent control, then you have less money to invest, because all in real terms, because all other costs are rising: construction costs, salaries, consumer prices, and only rents. They also rise, but not too much, because they are limited by rental break. So all these limits financial possibilities to undertake new projects. As a result, we have decrease in new housing construction. That's basically it. That's what I wanted to tell you about the effects of rental break. And I hope you enjoy it. And you can also watch other videos devoted to the housing market that are available on this YouTube channel. Thank you very much.